This is Lecture 2, Introduction to U.S. Government, aka Why Should We Even Care? What is the point of studying politics anyway? Can one person or one vote even make any kind of meaningful difference in the world? Fun fact, according to the ancient Greeks, an idiot was a person who did not participate in political discourse. So I think maybe there's our answer. We don't want to be idiots. Today we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to look at political apathy, just kind of a brief glance in the world because it's a real problem, especially in the United States. And that's partly because the way to benefit from government is to participate in it. We're also going to start looking at two of the fundamental questions of government. How should we govern, and what should government do? And I want to start off by just asking the question, what should government do? What should government be in charge of? Thomas Jefferson had an answer. Thomas Jefferson said, a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take away everything that you have. Now think about that. Which political party today do you think would be most likely to make that statement? The Republicans, right? That's a very Republican statement that big government is a problem. So maybe it would surprise you to know that Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat. The idea here is that what people want from government changes, and what political parties want from government changes. And different people see the same thing in different ways. Government is all about that. But figuring out what the government should do is one of the first problems that the United States would face as a country. And it's a problem that we face today, even though we don't always seem to be interested in facing it. If we look at these three graphs, this first one showing political apathy among young and old Americans from 1972 and then in 2008, this graph showing age and political knowledge in 1972 and 2008. And this presidential election turnout rate map for 1972 and 2008. We can see a clear trend, which is that people from 18 to 24 have started knowing less about politics, have started voting less frequently, and have started to sort of demonstrate a kind of apathy, a lack of caring about politics. Frankly, I blame this on myself. I think this is a Generation X problem. I think that when I was a teenager, it seemed really clear to me that all the major problems of the world were on the way to being solved. We'd had the civil rights movement, we had the women's movement, we seemed to be moving to a better place. And boy, was I wrong. I think we introduced the idea of apathy and implanted it in future generations. And now I am sorry, but you guys are going to have to fix it. You're going to have to care about politics and make the world a better place because clearly we have done a terrible job. Register to vote, get out there and make a difference, and learn about your government because that is the best way to affect change is to know how to do it. Of course, it's easy to affect change when you're writing a brand new constitution for a shiny new government. So let's talk about some of the ideas that underlie the United States Constitution. Today we're really going to talk about some of the considerations that influence the formulation and adoption of the Constitution. Next week we're going to look at separation of powers, checks and balances, a little bit about federalism, and some theories of democratic government. But today we're going to look at how the Constitution got started because I think that that is sort of the place to start with government. And maybe one question to ask is, what if the French and Indian War hadn't happened? What do you know about the French and Indian War? It's kind of unglamorous, right? We talked about it last year when we talked about North America's place in the Enlightenment. But the French and Indian War is really interesting. Parliament wanted the colonists to pay for the war. Their reasoning was that the people who benefited from the war should pay for it. So that meant that the colonies should bear all the taxes of the war. All the money that got spent on the war by Britain, colonists should pay back. And we see this whole series of events that spring from this idea, right? This resentment that the colonies felt, because remember, they didn't have representatives in the legislature. The Tea Party, the First Continental Congress, Common Sense, the Second Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people didn't even want a revolution. They just wanted things to go back to the way that they were before the French and Indian War. And so, as our framers sit down to write the Constitution, they must look back to this French and Indian War. They must look back to the problems of government that sort of created the revolution. And they must kind of worry. After all, they have just broken up with Great Britain. What are they going to do? How are they going to start a whole new government? Are they ready to get into another serious government relationship so soon after ending things with Great Britain? Thomas Jefferson, who is one of the key writers of the Declaration, is off in France. John Adams is in England. James Madison is in charge, and he's a pragmatist. He is not interested in pleasing the people, making the people happy. He wants to create the best possible government that he can. And that's what he does. He writes a constitution that is going to make sense to an average reader. Some of the language may seem a little antiquated to us, but there are no legal or technical terms really in the Constitution. It's written in very simple language that anyone can understand. And it's really easy to see a lot of the things that influenced it. First up, John Locke. I know you remember him. John Locke believed that people had natural rights. Remember, just by virtue of being human, by being born, you had the right to life, liberty, and property. And he thought that government should operate by the consent of the governed. People should agree on who governs them and what the government is allowed to do. And the purpose of government is to protect natural rights. So if the government oversteps its bounds, it puts itself in a state of war with the people, and revolution is inevitable and acceptable. The Articles of Confederation were also one of the things that influenced the Constitution, because the truth was the Articles of Confederation didn't work. Right after the Revolutionary War, the United States adopted the Articles of Confederation as its government. And you can really see that there's a desire not to have a strong central government in the Articles of Confederation. There's no president, no national court, no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, basically no power at all. The articles are intentionally weak. The government basically has the power to declare war and make peace. This proves to be a problem for the next idea that influences the Constitution, which is Shays' Rebellion. New political policies come in during the late 1700s that favor creditors over debtors. And so farms start to get foreclosed on and farmers start to protest, often armed protests. And there's no way for the government to protect people from the rebellion because there's no central government that allows, that keeps a militia or that keeps any kind of protection for the individual states. We also see a shift in the kind of people who are becoming leaders of the country. Before the Revolutionary War, as you can see, most of the people in the northern states and southern states were wealthy, but you see a good representation across the board. Lots of merchants and lawyers, lots of farmers, or at least a reasonable number of farmers. But after the war, you see more and more farmers. It's more agriculture, and you see more and more moderate income people. There's a real shift in the power structure that is going to lead to one of the other ideas that influences the Constitution, which is the idea of equality. This isn't explicitly stated in the Constitution, but it comes up in a few different places. It comes up in the representation of states, because obviously big states want representation to be the same for everybody. Whether you have 2 million people or 200 people, you should have the same number of representatives in government. Whereas big states say, hey, we're much bigger, our votes should count for more. So the Connecticut Compromise actually addresses this by creating a bicameral legislature, a legislature with two houses. One house, the Senate, has the same number of representatives for every state regardless of population. The other house, the House of Representatives, has its representation determined by the state's population. Slavery, of course, as we've said many times, is another issue. Lots of people wanted to outlaw slavery completely. States where slavery was an important part of the economic process didn't. So the Constitution just kind of touches on the future importing of slaves being limited. In 1808, it says we'll stop importing slaves. But there's another problem, which is how do you count slaves when you're enslaved people as part of the population? They can't vote, but neither can women, and women count as part of the population. So how should you count enslaved people? Well, the southern states wanted them to count as population because it made their numbers in the House of Representatives go up. The northern states didn't think that they should count at all. So they came up with the 3/5 compromise, which is so gross, and which says that for every enslaved person counts as 3/5 of a person. So you can count 3 out of every 5 slaves as a person for population. As far as voting goes, who should be able to vote, that's a big question, and the Constitution doesn't bother with it at all. It leaves it up to the states. The states can decide who votes. Finally, there's the economy. Because in order to have a strong economy, you need a strong national government. That's part of what made the Articles of Confederation fail, right? The Constitution was designed to be a living document, which means it was supposed to be a document that could change as it needed to be changed. And there are formal and informal processes for doing this. To formally amend the Constitution, there are 2 proposal methods and 2 ratification methods. 2/3 of each House of Congress or 3/4 of the state legislatures can approve an amendment. And then it becomes an official change to the Constitution. But we change the Constitution informally all the time. Every Supreme Court case interprets the Constitution and expands or limits the powers expressed in it. Technology has also helped informally amend the Constitution. Think about the ways that media and science have changed in the centuries since the Constitution was approved. And you'll see, like, the Constitution applies to all these things that didn't even exist when it was written. And consider the changing power of the president. These past years have been a really interesting look at what presidential power means. If you look at Article 2, Section 2, it's not even immediately clear the ways in which the presidential power was set up and what a big shift it has been. And this has happened over the years, during wars, and at all kinds of different times throughout history. It's just also happened recently. If you look at this chart, you can see a couple of the ways that amendment to the Constitution can happen. In phase 1 can happen in Congress or through a national convention. Congress can propose an amendment, which is what has happened every single time. But the states can also have a national convention where they propose an amendment. If 2/3 of the states request an amendment, then it goes to the second step of the process. And again, there are 2 steps to the process. State legislatures can ratify an amendment by a vote of 3/4 of the states, or state conventions can ratify an amendment by a vote of 3/4 of the states. This is what's so interesting, is that the Constitution is really set up to be flexible. Its flexibility is kind of written into it in an intrinsic way, which is a great thing about it because we can always change it. That's why political apathy doesn't make sense necessarily. Sorry, I know it's our fault. Generation X, I blame us. But because we have the power to change not just the law, not just the president, not just our representatives, but also the Constitution, the way that the United States government is set up can actually be pretty empowering. And we'll keep talking about this more next week.